I'm happy to introduce Arvind Panjabi, who's a senior research scientist at the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies in Fort Collins, where he works to conserve birds of Western North America through an integrated approach involving science, education, and land stewardship. Much of his career has focused on developing a scientific and social foundation to advance bird conservation in Latin America, especially in Mexico. And I learned tonight he's fluent in 3 languages, which is just maybe more. I don't know, that's really cool. And in Mexico, he's studied grassland birds since 2005 and currently coordinates a voluntary network of private conservation lands encompassing more than 600,000 acres in 3 states. He has co-authored over 20 peer-reviewed articles on the ecology and conservation of birds, including the recent landmark report published in Science, and has worked closely with government, academic, and other partner organizations to coordinate and implement high priority conservation actions for birds from Canada to Panama. And on a personal note, I got to work with this outstanding researcher for one summer. I think it was one of the best summers of my life, working on the initial assessment of the biodiversity of birds on Soapstone Prairie Preserve up in the Colorado-Wyoming border. And I'll just never forget that project. That was on the ground floor and really landmark and important research to preserve that, put a conservation plan into effect for the city of Fort Collins for the bird life of that property. But please welcome Arvind.
All right, give this technology a try here. I hear it's a little echoey there, but hopefully not too bad. If it goes haywire, I know where the mute button is. Yeah, I don't know, maybe it's picking me up from both microphones. But anyhow, we'll go ahead and get started and see how it goes. So yeah, thank you all for coming. My name is Arvind Panjabi. I'm, as Scott said, a researcher with the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And spent a lot of my career there focused on grassland birds because they are one of the most urgent conservation priorities from standpoint of declining populations. So grassland birds have been declining more rapidly and more extensively than other groups of birds. But that fits into this story that I'll be talking about a little bit tonight. Many of you are probably familiar with the story that came out a few years ago about the loss of 3 billion birds, nearly a third of our total bird population in North America, just in the last 50 years. So anyways, it's great to be here again. I think I was here last about 10 years ago talking to you all about grassland birds, so I'm not sure if any of you are here for that, but I was. We're going to start off with a little review about the science behind the paper, how we learned about the decline of loss of 3 billion birds from North America, and talk a little bit about the results, what they tell us, what they indicate, particularly about which biomes of North America are seeing the greatest declines in birds, but we'll also talk about some signs of hope that were also apparent in the data. And some of the response to the paper that hopefully will help us bring those birds back, at least some of them. As a result of this paper, it spawned a lot of interest and rallying cries for new and additional funding for conservation programs. So we'll talk about some of the exciting advances in that arena. And including some of the work I do at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And we'll end with the ways about how everyone here can help conserve birds, because it really is all of our responsibility. Just briefly, in case you don't know who the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies are, we were formed here in Colorado back in 1988 as the Colorado Bird Observatory. later changed our name to Rocky Mountain Bird Observatory, and finally changed our name to Bird Conservancy of the Rockies to more emphasize our focus on conservation, which has really been the thrust of our mission, which is to conserve birds and their habitats through an integrated approach of science, education, and land stewardship. Envision a future where birds are forever abundant, contributing to healthy landscapes and ecosystems, and inspiring human curiosity and love of nature. And we do this work not just here in Colorado in the Rocky Mountains and Great Plains regions, but all the way down through Mexico and Central America. I'd like to start off just taking a moment to marvel at this bird that is so perfect in so many ways. Weighs less than 5 grams, travels 3,000 plus miles twice a year, fueled entirely by nectar from flowers. Here's, you can see its distribution. Hopefully get that to play. Come on. Oh, it's not going to do it. Should be a button on there. I don't know why that's not showing up. Well, that's their wintering grounds. They breed, of course, up in the Pacific Northwest, and many of you may have seen this bird passing through Colorado, particularly in the late summer and fall. They get to be one of the more common hummingbirds in the foothills and mountains of Colorado, and even out on the plains. But this little bird that can survive freezing cold temperatures and this incredible journey has seen an almost 70% population loss just since 1970. That is the Rufous hummingbird. Yes, thanks for asking. Yes, one of 4 species of hummingbirds that we typically have here in Colorado. So nearly 70% population loss in 50 years. And in just the last 10 years of data that we've been able to analyze, we see almost another 30% loss on top of that. So what is going on with this bird, right? It's pretty emblematic of the problems that we face as bird conservation is trying to understand what are the factors behind the decline of almost 300 species here in North America. They share some things in common with other birds and other things they don't. So it's really tough to nail down the individual causes for all these species that we are seeing declines in. But let's go back to a moment in time, some of you may remember, when this book was published, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. She was one of the first people to bring to our attention the declines of migratory birds that she had been observing in her neighborhood in Washington, D.C. And she helped spawn a movement. And one of her close friends was Chandler Robbins, who at the time worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And because of her book, was inspired to start the North American Breeding Birds Survey program in 1967, or actually 66 was the first year. And since then, this program has been essential at providing us information on the population status and trends of our birds in the United States and southern Canada. This map here shows a given species, where it's declining in red, where it's increasing in blue. And we see the patterns are not always clear cut. So it's been an incredibly important program. And from this, we've done many analyses over the years to learn about bird population. I have known that a number of species have been declining over the years. This is a composite graph here showing the declines of birds associated with different biomes like grasslands and boreal forests, eastern forests, and so forth. But what we've never been able to answer with information like this is whether, or is how many birds we're losing. And are we losing more birds than we're gaining? Because you can see here, there's one trajectory there that's showing a positive trend. So this was the question that sort of drove us to look at and compile as much data as we could on as many species as we could to understand whether we have lost more birds than we've gained since 1970. So to do this, we of course went to programs like the Breeding Bird Survey to get information on species there. But the Breeding Bird Survey doesn't cover all the species of North America. In fact, no single survey does. But the Christmas bird count covers a few others that we weren't able to track with the Breeding Bird Survey. And then we compiled a number of species-specific surveys from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, and other sources. In total, we were able to compile this information for 529 species, which is a pretty good percentage, but of course is not all the birds of North America. One group of birds that was particularly not well represented in our study are the seabirds, many of which nest offshore. But North America has, US and Canada has about 700 species. So this is a pretty sizable portion of the breeding species of the continent. You can see we relied heavily on the Breeding Bird Survey for estimates of population sizes for land birds in particular, also some water birds, and then filled in the gaps for other species with other sources of information. And likewise for the trends, the majority of trends came from the Breeding Bird Survey. Now, fortunately, we had much of this information already compiled, curated, and analyzed in a database that I just happen to manage as part of my work at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And this is the Partners in Flight Avian Conservation Assessment Database. And this is something that Colorado Bird Observatory back in the day helped start and has since provided the basis for countless bird conservation plans, species priority lists like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Birds of Conservation Concern, the Partners in Flight watch list. But anyway, so we had much of this information compiled. Some of it we updated, and we actually found some additional surveys that had not been included in the database prior to that. But we combined this information through a hierarchical model of population change. And from that, we developed results at the biome level by grouping species together under certain biomes like grasslands and eastern forests and southwestern arid lands. But we wanted to have also a completely independent source of information to help corroborate the ground survey data. And so we turned to weather radar. Now, weather radar is a tool that's been used by ornithologists for a number of decades, but it's been changing over the years. And in particular, with the advent of Doppler weather radar, we have the ability to discern birds aloft in the air. And that's what you're seeing here on this image are birds that are taking off from the ground at night and getting picked up by Doppler weather radar. So Doppler weather radar can measure the speed and the direction of objects in the air, and it can also measure the size of those objects. And birds in particular give off a particular reflectivity signal that makes them identifiable in the radar data because of their size and their behavior, how they fly. So we combined information from 143 NEXRAD weather stations. This was my co-author, Adrian Doctor at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And of course, he needed a huge supercomputer to analyze all this data, but he was able to estimate the total biomass aloft in the spring migration. We chose spring because spring was most closely related to the breeding bird populations that are also monitored by the ground surveys. And by adding up this data across all stations and then going back in time to look at how that volume of biomass has changed over the years, we could develop an independent source of data to verify changes in the bird population across. This is a major flyway for birds of North America that go up to breed into Canada in the boreal forests. Now, when we looked at the survey data, what we found was a net loss of 2.9 billion birds from the breeding populations in North America between 1970 and 2017. That's a roughly 29% total loss of abundance across all species that we looked at, 529 species. And fully 57% of those species, just over 300, showed statistically significant declines in the ground survey data. Now, when we looked at the changes in volume of biomass aloft in the spring, we were only able to go back to 2007, which is when this technology started. But just during that time, we also found some rather interesting patterns, particularly in the eastern United States. Those red solid circles indicate radar stations that showed statistically significant declines in the biomass aloft in spring that they had been measuring over that period. And by combining this surface of trend in the biomass aloft with the total volume of biomass passage, we could actually estimate how many birds were being lost during migration over this period, 2007 to 2017. And so, as I mentioned, the declines are primarily in the east, particularly in the Mississippi flyway, so going over the Midwest. And again, these are birds that are primarily flying up into Canada, into the boreal forest to nest, which is, you maybe know, the boreal forest is like our breadbox of songbird production in North America. It's some of the most abundant populations. So we found a total loss of almost 14% in the biomass aloft over this period, which corresponded to an annual rate of 1.5%, very similar to the overall rate of decline in our bird population from the ground survey data. Now, when we look at the net population change by biome, a few things jump out. You'll see grasslands right away. Fully 53% of grassland birds have disappeared from North America during this time. 37% of all shorebirds have disappeared during this time. Surprisingly, a third of all the birds in the boreal forest, this place where millions, if not billions of birds live, certainly billions, 33% decline. And even here in our western forests, we see a nearly 30% decline in areas that we generally tend to think of as being fairly safe and secure for birds. They're public lands, after all, most of them. And surprisingly, least decline in birds in the eastern forests. And when we look at this in terms of absolute loss and relative loss, again, we see a 53% loss of grassland birds, but that equates to 720 million birds lost from this ecosystem over just those 47 years, and around 500 million birds lost from the boreal forest, and a small gain in wetland birds during this time, of roughly 20 million or 13% increase. So that's the one little bit of good news there. So there were winners and losers beyond just the wetland birds. In total, we saw a net loss of 3.2 billion birds, but then we gained about 250 million birds during that same time frame. So in total, there are 38 bird families that showed a net population loss, and 90% of the total loss could be attributed just to 12 families of birds. And you can see on the graph here which ones those are. The American sparrows and wood warblers in particular, also the blackbirds, make up a good portion of that total loss. And then there were 29 bird families that showed a net population gain, including some rather surprising results like the vireos. So red-eyed vireo is, of course, one of the common widespread vireos across North America, but there's several others. And for whatever reason, they all have increasing population trends, or stable. With the case of our plumbeous vireo here in the West, it has a largely stable trend since 1970. But all the other ones, including like gray vireo, black-cap vireo, we don't have trend data on, so that was not one of the species analyzed here. But blue-headed vireo, Cassin's vireo, warbling vireo. They are all showing population increases. So something very interesting going on there, because those birds, of course, share habitat, both on the breeding grounds and wintering grounds and migration strategies with many of these other birds. So a great question for researchers to take on and try to understand what is happening with vireos. And then some other birds in that group of increasing species, perhaps not so surprising. Raptors have been increasing since 1970, thanks to the elimination of DDT from most of our areas. Turkeys and grouse, we also have seen notable increases in, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with seeing more turkeys today than ever before. Now, looking at the loss, one thing that really jumped out to us in this study was the loss of common species. 50% of the loss that we measured was made up of 10 abundant species. And these are not necessarily habitat specialists. These are, many of them, backyard birds, habitat generalists. This was one of the more surprising results, that many of the birds we're losing are not just those rare and unique species, but these widespread common species. And even more surprising was the staggering loss of introduced species, species that came here and right away began to explode in numbers and colonize new areas and seemed to be doing so very well. But as you see here, since the 1970s, we've lost 400 million of these birds: starlings, house sparrows, rock pigeons. So why does this matter? Well, I probably don't need to convince many of you, but it's important to understand that even the most abundant species can go extinct, and the species decline before they go extinct. And now, back when the passenger pigeon was declining, of course, we didn't have monitoring programs and things like that in place, but today we do. So we have some early warning systems that can alert us and help us take action to avoid a similar situation to what we saw with the passenger pigeon over 100 years ago. The loss of ecosystem integrity is also something that we need to be concerned about. You can only imagine what the loss of a third of all the birds from the boreal forest means for the insects in the forest and the trees and the plants and the other species that depend on those birds for food. They're an important link in the food chain. We're also losing the opportunity to observe birds in our own backyards, in our neighborhoods and open spaces, to be able to connect with nature and to witness that spectacle of migration. I bet some of you can remember when birds during migration were common, and you just see like every bush or tree would have some kind of migrant go in it, and we just don't see that as much anymore. And that's resulted in this shifting baseline syndrome, right? Where many of our young people and even older people today might walk out in the woods, not hear any birds in May and not think anything of it. But that's something that we don't want to normalize. And so these birds really are the canary in the coal mine, because eventually we might not be next, but eventually, if we keep going down this trajectory of an unsustainable planet, we will eventually succumb to the same threats that are facing these birds. So one of our mantras in the bird conservation world is to keep common birds common. Try to prevent declines before they become too severe and expensive to deal with. Now, we didn't deal specifically with the drivers of declines in our papers, but they are worth mentioning because there are a few big ones that are still considered the main drivers of habitat loss for birds. And habitat loss is believed to still be the primary cause behind the decline of so many birds. But it is not the only factors affecting bird populations. On top of habitat loss, we have the effects of agrochemicals, which are increasingly toxic these days, and the effects of climate change, which are pervasive and widespread and inescapable by birds. And then we have a whole array of human-induced mortality things that we do in our society that that affects bird populations. And that's something that we have direct control over and can help change. So, but one important point, like I mentioned with the rufous hummingbird there, is that not all bird species are affected by the same threats. And so while we can talk about threats in a general and broad sense, tying individual threats to a specific species decline in its life history and understanding where in its life cycle this threat is impacting either the survival of the population or the reproduction of the population. This takes a lot of research to figure that out. So it's a challenge. But the human-caused mortality is an area of recent research that has helped shed some light on things that we do in our society that affect birds. Perhaps the biggest of that is letting our cats go outside. It's been estimated that free-ranging cats, including feral cats, kill an estimated 2.4 billion birds per year in the United States alone. You can only imagine how many more cats are killing birds in Mexico and Central America and other places as well. And you might think, well, wait a minute, if we lost 2.9 billion birds over 50 years, how are we losing 2.4 billion birds per year? Well, the numbers are estimated through different approaches, but it's important to realize that with an estimated breeding population of maybe around 10 billion birds in North America, each fall that number increases 3-4-fold or more due to reproduction of and young birds coming into the population. So many of the birds that are killed by cats are part of that broader population, not necessarily the breeding population. And so our results about the 3 billion birds lost is from the breeding population, but this is from the total population on an annual basis. And it's no small number. Many of those birds would otherwise be performing their ecological functions in the ecosystems. The other important source, very important source of mortality is collisions with buildings, glass in particular. And this is a big problem in our cities, and it's a big problem around our homes, especially for those of us who live out in nature and are surrounded by forests and shrublands, and bird collisions on ground floor windows in particular is a major cause of mortality and something that we have solutions to deal with. And I'll be talking about that a little later. And then to put things in perspective, collisions with power lines are estimated to kill around 30 million birds a year. And collisions with stationary towers, including wind turbines, are estimated to kill around 6.6 million birds a year. So put those all in perspective. We can do a lot to help birds simply by keeping our cats indoors and helping to prevent collisions on windows. And again, we have ways of doing that. So birds are facing multiple interacting threats from habitat loss, climate change, and then human-induced mortality on top of that. Now, are there reasons for hope? I'd say yes. Bird populations are resilient. Hey, I saw a bald eagle on my way down here today. 50 years ago, that would have been very unlikely, right? And so the recovery of the bald eagle is a major conservation success story that highlights that when we identify the cause of a population decline and commit ourselves to doing something about it, bird populations can respond very quickly. And they're not the only success story, right? The peregrine falcon, California condor. There's now more free-flying California condors today than there's been at any point in the last 100 years. The Kirtland's warbler. There are more Kirtland's warblers today than there have ever been, as far as we know, at least since 1970, when there were just over 100 pairs. Now there's over 1,200. The whooping crane is another one, a little more tenuous, but has still increased from a handful of birds to a wild population of around 500 individuals now. So conservation works, and there's perhaps no better illustration of this than the example of waterfowl. And when hunters raised their voices and money for wetland conservation and waterfowl management and legislation to protect wetlands, they saw a big difference and made a big difference. And the waterfowl populations are up by 56% since 1970. Saw some green-winged teal flying over Boulder on my way down here today. So how do we replicate these successes for other birds? Well, thanks to, in part to the 3 Billion Birds paper, we have a little moment in time for conservation. Once again, much like Rachel Carson created with Silent Spring, where we captured the public's attention. And this was evident by the response we saw to the paper. It was reported on in more than 1,700 newspapers, media outlets around the world, had an estimated reach of 3.8 billion people in just the first few months after its publication. And it's one of the most cited papers, science papers of all time. And the reporting was largely positive, accurate, and sympathetic. So how has the conservation community responded? It's one thing to get public sympathy and support. It's another thing to get politicians and to change the way they do things. So, well, there's fortunately been a tremendous swell of interest and a lot of pointing to the paper of the 3 billion birds lost as justification for we need to do more and we need to do more fast. And so I'm going to talk about a few different initiatives. This is by no means comprehensive. There's lots of other things going on in other parts of the country, but this is something that I'm closely involved with here with Grasslands in particular. So I'll talk a little bit about the Grasslands Roadmap initiative and the Joint Venture 8, the JV8 initiative, which joint ventures, if you're not familiar with those, they are public-private partnerships helped set up by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but aimed at tracking accomplishments across all different people working in conservation, from states to private NGOs to federal agencies and others, to try to track conservation achievements and coordinate on conservation actions. So those joint ventures now are collaborating across the central grasslands on grassland conservation. A few other initiatives I just mentioned quickly here. The Chihuahuan Desert Conservation Investment Strategy is part of, related to all this focus on grasslands, but particularly focused on that southern end where grasslands are very limited, threats are very high. We'll talk more about what the work we're doing down there. But we hope that that will provide a blueprint for investment, conservation investment in that region. With all the attention on grassland birds, we've managed to get 2026 designated as the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists by the United Nations. So that will be celebrated and recognized worldwide with a number of monthly events throughout the year aimed at bringing attention to the importance of grasslands for people and biodiversity and rangelands. And I'm going to talk here about some of our conservation programs in just a minute, and just to mention some of these other major initiatives so you're aware of them in case you weren't. You've probably heard of America the Beautiful, maybe wondered what it is, but it was an initiative started by the Biden administration as part of their commitment towards the broader 3030 initiative, which is a global initiative aimed at conserving 30% of the world's lands and waters by 2030. So that effort has just invested 145 million of new conservation funding into protecting lands, easements, habitat restoration, community-based conservation with tribes. There's been a lot of really great projects that have been funded through that initiative. Canada has really stepped up their conservation investments. They are investing around 2.3 billion Canadian dollars annually, which is just under 2 billion US, for their Priority Places initiative. And then there's been a new initiative started specifically aimed at supporting research to identify those limiting factors for some of our most threatened and rapidly declining birds. That's the Road to Recovery initiative. with a local foundation based in Wyoming, the Knobloch Family Foundation, supporting 1 million annually for research, which is a drop in the bucket, admittedly, but still is new funding supporting an important need. So now I'm going to focus a little bit on the Grasslands Roadmap. What that is, it's a multinational initiative aimed at saving our grasslands in the central grasslands region of North America. It's an unprecedented, diverse, equitable, and inclusive coalition to address the grassland bird crisis. It includes a number of shared priorities across the three countries, but is also aimed at advancing road to recovery science to identify those limiting factors for birds, creating roadmaps for population recovery, full annual cycle conservation for declining bird species, a bold new policy agenda, and a unified messaging and collaboration around a rallying call to bring back 3 billion birds. Excuse me just a moment. So this is what's really inspired the Grasslands Roadmap, is this unprecedented coalition involving 7 different sectors from 3 different countries, and including indigenous nations throughout and from the start. And that is something that is different than how conservation has traditionally been done by all these other sectors in the past. So one of the things that the Grassland Roadmap is focusing on is protecting the core and growing the core of our grasslands. As you can see here in this map, the core is the dark green areas on the west side of the central grasslands. Those vulnerable grasslands are the grasslands in yellow, and the areas in purple there are grasslands that have already been converted to cropland or forests. And so this notion of growing the core and restoring and connecting vulnerable grasslands is sort of the mantra that we carry. And so since 2020, this started in 2020, perfect timing, right? We had to hold our first summit to get this off the ground virtually, but we had, even in that summit, over 300 people attend, representing 150 different organizations from the 3 countries, including multiple indigenous nations. Some of the outcomes from this work, we do have a roadmap document also that outlines the priorities and the work to be done. But partners have submitted a North American Grasslands Conservation Act, or submitted is not the right word. What is it called? We introduced the North American Grasslands Conservation Act into Congress in 2022. It has not passed, but it needs to pass. And there's a bunch of pending legislation I'll talk about in a little bit too. But that would provide funding for grasslands conservation to support conservation on private lands, because of course grasslands are primarily in private land ownership. So we need to think about that private lands perspective and the tribal lands perspective. But we have also helped generate $500 million in new investment in grasslands conservation from agencies like the NRCS, Canadian Wildlife Service, as well as foundations operating in this region. We've recently hired a full-time grasslands coordinator to help lead this effort. And there are 11 different working groups right now in the 3 countries that are working on advancing the shared priorities around partnerships, funding, new funding, and policy, as well as science. So that's the Grasslands Roadmap. I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the work we do at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies related to grasslands conservation in particular. One of these is our private lands stewardship program. Currently, we have 15 habitat biologists. I think we're getting ready to hire 3 more in the next few months. But these are the areas where they operate. They're sort of assigned to certain counties in certain states. And these are biologists that are shared positions with agencies like NRCS and state wildlife agencies. So it provides a shared funding model. They get an employee for 1/3 the cost. we get a lot of support for this employee, like an office, a computer, and a vehicle. And also they have access to funding programs that we wouldn't necessarily have access to, things like the Farm Bill and other state programs. But you maybe know the Farm Bill is our largest conservation program in North America. There's billions of dollars in there for conservation on private lands. So our goal is to make the most use of that money to do good bird habitat conservation work on private lands. So that's one of the efforts that we do here to deal with grasslands, which are, like I said, primarily on private lands. And oops, here's some of the partners. And of course, there's a need to do similar work on the other end of the life cycle. The Chihuahuan Desert is a critically important area for grassland birds that breed in Colorado and elsewhere in the Western Great Plains. 90% of the species that breed in the grasslands of the Western Great Plains winter in the Chihuahuan Desert. So it's a total of 28 species, all of which are recognized as some sort of high conservation priority according to one entity or another, a state agency, partners in flight, or a federal government in one of the three countries. And as you maybe can see on the map on the left here, that the amount of grassland in the southern part of this ecosystem is way less than we have in the north. Largely that's due to a natural phenomenon that is a desert down there. And even what you see down there is probably an overrepresentation of what is actually suitable grassland habitat today. It's estimated about 15% of the Chihuahuan Desert is grassland, but much less than that is actually what we consider suitable habitat for grassland birds, with enough grass cover and enough open area to support those species. So there's a lot of concentration that happens when the birds go down into this area. And there's a lot of issues happening down there. So shrub encroachment and desertification is one of the major contributors to grassland loss in the Chihuahuan Desert. This has been going on for over 150 years. It's a slow, gradual process, very difficult to stop once it's started. And as you can see on this picture on top here, it's largely due to the type of management that has been happening on a piece of land. So you can see a more continuous long-term grazing. On one side of the fence, we have shrubs moving in, whereas the more rotational periodic grazing on the right side, it does not lead to that same level of shrub encroachment. Cropland conversion is now perhaps the #1 most urgent threat on the wintering grounds for grassland birds because it is accelerating so rapidly. Climate change is also another threat that is increasingly becoming apparent and obvious as a major threat to grassland birds on their wintering grounds. And grassland birds in the winter are dependent on what the conditions were like there in the summer, because that's when the grasses grow and the seed is produced. And so Chihuahuan Desert has been in a period of prolonged and increasingly frequent drought with less rain. And so that is not boding well for the grassland birds there either. But there are ways that we can make grasslands more resilient to climate change. So, and then there's limited conservation capacity to begin with, both within the government, within private organizations. There's essentially zero land trusts working down in that area to permanently protect lands. So there's a major need for that. And what this graph here shows on the bottom is that grassland birds of North America that winter in the Chihuahuan Desert, which are essentially those of the Western Great Plains, have population declines twice as large as other grassland birds. So the Chihuahuan Desert is an area that requires a lot of attention, and that's why it's been the main focus of my work for the last almost 20 years now. So I'm not going to be able to talk about all this stuff tonight, but I just wanted to throw it up there to sort of let you know what we have been doing down there, because for the first 10 years I was working down there, research was a major part of my focus to understand about where the birds were. In the first place, we had no data on where the birds were, where the grasslands were. And we've since got a much better handle of that, as well as an understanding of how climate drives bird abundance from one year to the next. We've also been monitoring grassland loss through satellite imagery, analysis of satellite imagery. We've done research on species survival during the winter, their habitat requirements, their home range use and their movements, migration, migration connectivity with breeding grounds as well, studying the diets of sparrows, what they eat on their wintering grounds to understand what grasses are most important to promote and management, and to understand how birds use other types of habitats like croplands, because we know some grassland birds do and some grassland birds don't. We've also focused a lot on capacity building. We've trained over 150 Mexican biologists since 2006. We've conducted numerous education programs in the area. We had a full-time educator for a number of years working in the Janos area in northern Chihuahua, and certainly introduced a lot of kids in that area to birds, grassland birds, as well as working with ranchers on best management practices. And starting around 2012 is when I started to shift my focus towards habitat protection, restoration, and management through a program that I created there called the Sustainable Grazing Network. I'll tell you a little bit about that. It's a voluntary network of conservation lands in the Chihuahuan Desert aimed at protecting and enhancing wintering habitat for grassland birds and supporting ranchers in grassland and environmental stewardship. Started with 2 ranches back in 2012, and we've grown to include 36 ranches and about 660,000 acres in these counties here in primarily northern Chihuahua, but also in northeastern Sonora and northern Coahuila, all south of the border. And we provide cost share and technical assistance to landowners on grazing management and habitat restoration and grassland restoration. And we do that in part through developing an integrated wildlife and range management plan for each property that kind of spells out what their resources and challenges are in regards to each and sets goals and objectives for both those. And then we help, like I said, with the cost share projects to implement the priorities identified in the wildlife and rangeland management plans. And we conduct bird and vegetation monitoring annually on these properties to see what kind of impact we're having. So again, we're working to promote regenerative and sustainable grazing practices to make these ranches, many of which are huge. The average size of a ranch down there is around 20,000 acres. So each one is its own nature preserve in its own right. It's a little hard to see this picture on the upper right here. There's actually pronghorn, endangered Mexican pronghorn in that photo off here to the right. And of course the cattle and the Aplomado falcon nest platform that we've installed there. The Aplomado falcon, I don't know how many are familiar with it. It's a widespread raptor found mostly on the Gulf Coast from South Texas down into South America through the Andes and the Pampas grasslands. But there is a small population in the Chihuahuan Desert, used to extend into the United States, but it's now just totally limited to Chihuahua. And there's only about 15 pairs of this potentially a distinct subspecies left. It is actually from museum specimens, the few that there are of this population, it's about 8% larger on average than the nominate subspecies that is along the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And they are a desert adapted population. And despite a really intensive effort to try to reestablish them, using birds from the Gulf Coast population, they never took hold. They hacked over 100 birds in Texas and New Mexico, but none of them ever reproduced on their own successfully, and could be because they were of the wrong genetics for that environment. So just to give you a sense of some of the other projects that we do, some of the habitat restoration work we do, of course, these ranchers are great partners for this kind of work because this benefits them as well. So this is what a lot of the Chihuahuan Desert grasslands, quote unquote, look like today. They've largely been taken over by mesquite, which is the tall shrub you see here. So what we do, and we'll go in there with a bulldozer and take out those mesquites. And it looks pretty ugly at first, but within a year or two, we see the native grasses coming back. And right away, this is an area where birds like grasshopper sparrows and Baird sparrows and chestnut-collared longspurs can live and thrive compared to the previous shrub encroached grassland. So a couple other examples of this, we generally try to select sites that have moderate to low levels of shrub encroachment. But as we've seen from our habitat models, even a low level of shrubs can affect the survival of birds, other grassland birds in those areas. So again, just 1 year post-treatment here. And we do all this without any use of chemicals. The landowners there are not keen on using chemicals. So here's another type of practice we do called keyline plowing. We use this targeting areas of what we call hard pan soils, which is something you find in the desert where the ground is just like rock. And when the rain hits it, it just runs off and nothing ever grows there. So using a tractor with a very shallow furrow plow behind there, we create these shallow furrows, and that helps the water penetrate the soil. It captures windblown seed from the area. And again, within just 12 months, we can have an incredible turnaround on these sites. And these are all native grasses that are coming in here. Here's another site, keyline plow, 1 year later. And one more here in a different ranch in northern Chihuahua. Again, one of the drier parts of the desert, but we had a good response in just 1 year. So that's the type of work we do on the Sustainable Grazing Network. Here are some of the numbers of what we've done over the last 5 years. Of course, we do this all with grant funds. We don't have the farm bill to support this work, unfortunately. So we have to raise every dollar, and the landowners put in 50% of the cost as well on all these projects, including the shrub control and the keyline projects. A lot of it focused on the infrastructure that they need to be able to do rotational grazing and allow grasslands to rest, to recover, and regenerate. So a lot of it has to do with water, getting water in the right places on the ranches to be able to rotate the cattle away from just where they've had infrastructure before, and that's where the highest impact has been. And those tend to be in what were the best grasslands. Another thing we do on these ranches are what we call simple conservation solutions for birds. These are things like installing nest cribs for Aplomado falcons that greatly increase the success rate of their nests by keeping out predators like great horned owls. Installing stock tank ladders. These are actually 2-meter high corrugated steel ramps that go into open stock water storage tanks, which are the bigger hazard there because they're open and deep. And what we found, we put some cameras on some of these ramps 1 year and found that the birds don't actually use them to climb out of the water after falling in. They just use them to safely access the water to get a drink. And then the other thing we do on all of our partner ranches is seal up open pipes whenever we find them in gates and fence posts, because this has come to light as being a hazard for many cavity nesting birds, in particular, things like rock wrens and bluebirds and ash-throated flycatchers. So that's the work of the SGN. Now, what can we all do to help birds? Because there is a lot, right? And it's all of our responsibility. One thing that Audubon does a great job of is helping its members become a force for nature and making our voices heard. And we need to do this more and more because we are a force for conservation. Just like the hunters were a force for waterfowl conservation, we can be a force for all bird conservation. 45 million bird watchers in the United States contributing 41 billion annually to the economy. And like I said, there are a number of important bills that have been introduced in Congress that have just stalled recently. So I mentioned the North American Grasslands Conservation Act. There's perhaps the biggest game changer of all is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. That would provide $4.1 billion in new funding to go to the states to help support their state wildlife action plans, which are primarily focused on non-game species. There was the Migratory Birds of the Americas Conservation Enhancement Act of 2023. It would have increased funding for the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act, our only act and funding source for bird conservation work outside of the United States and dedicated to neotropical migratory birds. But it doubled the funding from 5 million to where it is currently to 10 million. The Bird Safe Windows Act, this was introduced in 2020. Actually, I think it's been introduced every year since 2019 and still hasn't passed. But it would provide just common sense measures to help reduce bird collisions on our federal buildings. Then there's the Albatross and Petrel Conservation Act of 2021. This would authorize the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service to protect albatrosses and petrels on the high seas, prohibit unauthorized take, and promote international cooperation around their conservation. And as you may know, albatrosses and petrels, seabirds in general, are some of the most threatened birds in the world right now because of bycatch issues, but also climate change. So I'd like to end with, again, these 7 simple ways that we can all help birds. Maybe you've heard of these already. This was something that we came up with when we wrote the paper to be able to give people something to do, right? Instead of just putting this bad news out there. We wanted people to be able to take some actions. And like I said, there's a lot we can all do around our homes and in our daily lives. So one of those is making windows safer for birds day and night. There are a couple different options that are readily available, easy to install. Some you can do it yourself, like these strings on the outside of the windows. There's also companies that will make these. I've put these up on my picture windows at home. I live in the foothills and have lots of birds around my house, so it's really important to me that I don't have bird deaths on my windows when I'm attracting them to feeders and such. And I've been able to eliminate bird collisions, deadly bird collisions with my windows. I just actually purchased some of these little dots. I'm going to try those out on a different window that I don't have as much issue with, but so there's a couple simple solutions out there already. I probably don't need to mention keeping cats indoors, but just in case, because this is a big one and it's a hard one, right? Because we love cats, our cats, people, those of us who have cats, and we feel like they need to be outside to be happy. But in reality, cats are much safer indoors. Cats that spend their lives indoors live like 5 times longer on average than cats, are not subject to disease, to predation, to cars, other awful things that could happen to them. So this is just a cultural shift we need to start embracing and passing down through the generations and encouraging all of our friends and neighbors to do. And again, it's better for the cats, better for the environment. We don't want to see this. You can imagine places around where these feral colonies have established themselves can just be devoid of birds altogether. And like I said, I'm a cat owner myself. I have 2 happy cats that stay indoors all the time, and they don't even have any interest in going outdoors.
Wouldn't be very safe out there either.
That's right. I mean, there's coyotes, there's bobcats, there's mountain lions, there's yeah. But we have lots of hummingbirds and towhees and other birds that they could kill if they were let outside. So another one that we can all do in our own backyards is reducing the amount of lawn we have and planting more natives. It's been shown that neighborhoods that have a higher percentage of native trees have more native birds, and those birds do better. They have a higher reproductive success. And we can do this in our backyards, make our backyards an important stopover site for migrating birds, and also scale this up in our green spaces and make sure we're planting native, locally appropriate species that provide resources for birds, like fruit and nectar, but also just native insects. And along those lines, avoiding pesticides, again, both in our yards and in our public spaces, but we also need to embrace this in our food production systems. And I think folks in Boulder are pretty good about that already. eating locally sourced foods and organic foods that don't require pesticides and large monocultures. Another thing related to our food that we all need to do is drink coffee that's good for the birds. And this good coffee for the birds is also some of the best tasting coffee in the world. It's grown in places like this in Central America and South America and mountainous regions that are key habitats for our neotropical migrants that come from North America and spend the winters down there. So by drinking shade-grown coffee, and this has to be natural shade, like native canopy species from the forest there that provide the native substrates for insects, as well as fruit for birds. They are incredibly important both for migrants and for resident birds and provide very good habitat for those species. So try to look for the Smithsonian label when you're shopping for your coffee, the bird-friendly habitat label, because there are a lot of different labels out there for shade-grown coffee, and they don't all mean the same thing, unfortunately. It's a little confusing. But a lot of them allow any kind of tree like banana trees or non-native trees to be planted and count as shade, but it's not the same as when they leave the native forest overstory intact. All right, plastics, I probably don't need to say too much about this. I think you know, in particular for marine birds, plastics are deadly. They ingest them, and this is what happens to them. So the plastics in our ocean is a real big problem, but of course, all that plastic is born on land. And so it's up to us to encourage our favorite restaurants and other places we go to not use plastic and styrofoam. If you see that, it's just a friendly comment to say, hey, you know, this is really bad for the environment. I'd sure come here a lot more often and get takeout more often if you used paper instead of plastic. And there are a lot of paper and compostable alternatives. Lastly, something we all do, maybe, many of us at least, is to watch birds and share what we see. Of course, eBird has become a major platform for capturing information about our birds worldwide. I was just looking at some of the data today. There's 90 million checklists now been entered into eBird. There's almost 1 million eBirders worldwide. And there's more than, I think it was 10,800 species have been reported in eBird. I think that's got to be like all the birds of the world. So pretty incredible. I personally use this information in a lot of the work we do, a lot of the work that the data we manage in that avian conservation assessment database. More and more, we're relying on data from eBird to populate that because eBird has a more comprehensive scope for many of these species than, for example, the breeding bird survey. So go out and see birds, record what you see, and share what you see. And lastly, I'm just going to mention one other way that everyone can help birds is to support local bird conservation organizations, because we are the ones working on the front lines to engage people. People need to be part of the solution. Can't just save birds and hope the birds will save themselves from there. We need to engage people in conservation, and that takes people boots on the ground to do that. And so if this talk has inspired you at all to do that, come visit our website and consider becoming a member of Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And there's lots of other great bird conservation organizations to support as well. So thank you very much. I hope I've left a little bit of time for questions. If there are any, I'm happy to take them. Yes.
Wait a second. Let me have you speak through the microphone.
With the ranchers in Chihuahua, what is their incentive? You said they have to pay half the cost. What's their incentive for doing it?
Yeah, so the incentive is that they get to keep the infrastructure, and it helps them produce healthier, fatter cows in the long run. I mean, their goal is to turn grass into money. And they need to have healthy grasslands to be able to turn that grass into money on a sustainable, reliable way. So having the infrastructure where they can ration their grass across a broader time and build in a buffer so that they don't use it up each year. There's some ranchers we work with right now who they didn't get much rain at all last summer, but thanks to their conservative grazing practices and this rational grazing where they're rationing out the grassland over a long period of time, he's got enough grass on his 5,000 hectare ranch to feed 1,000 head of cattle until like the middle of 2025. And whereas most other ranchers have already gone through all their grass. It's pretty incredible what they can do with the right knowledge and then the right infrastructure. Yeah.
Carol, question from Zoom.
This is Sandra, and yes, Megan, would you unmute and ask your question?
Hi, Arvind. Sorry I can't be there in person tonight.
No worries.
I had two quick questions, particularly around the Chihuahuan restoration work. One, I'm wondering how cheatgrass is impacting those efforts. You can talk about in Colorado and across the rest of the area as well if you want to. And then the second one, I'm just wondering what you're using to fill or cap those pipes with on the ranches. In the photo, it looked like spray foam or caulking or something like that. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so first about the exotic grasses. Well, cheatgrasses, we don't actually have that down in the desert where I'm working, but there are a number of other exotic grasses. The biggest one, one of most concern anyways, is the layman's love grass. So that's something, it's a real challenge because there's not any tried and true way to get rid of it once it's come in. And it's pretty widespread and established. But one thing we encourage the ranchers to do is to graze that pretty hard in the spring. It does green up, just like cheatgrass before the warm season grasses. It does continue to stay green through the summer, but by grazing it hard, they can at least set the stage for those warm season grasses to have a competitive advantage when the conditions turn right for them. So we just try to keep a close eye on it, and we also try to not implement restoration projects like keyline or shrub control in areas that have a major infestation of the layman's love grass, because likely it'll come back and dominate in those places. Let's see, the second half of your question, what was it now?
It was on what's the material used for capping those pipes? It looked like spray foam.
Yeah. I think we've used a variety of things and sometimes even just filled them with rock. So like finding just the right size rock to stick in the top of the hole. And that way the birds can't get in there. And so we used whatever we could find. I think they did use some foam at one point, some sealing foam. I'm not sure how well that's worked in the long run, but we kind of, they do carry some of that foam, I think, in their trucks. But also just using whatever material we have around there to fill that hole.
Okay, thank you very much. My sister has a ranch and I'm passing this information on to her.
Oh, very good.
Another question from the audience. Anybody?
I was interested in the decline of introduced species. Could part of that be because this habitat they're not totally acclimated to it?
Yeah, I think the more likely, I mean, they're in cities and backyards and such, but they're also in agricultural landscapes, right? Starlings and house sparrows and pigeons, you see them around farms and barns. And I think it's the intensification of cropland landscape, sort of less trees, less margins that are left unproductive, untreated, that previously would have had diversity of forbs that would have supported insects. I think and then the application of pesticides and herbicides that have diminished insects and those forbs that has resulted in a loss of food for those birds.
Before we take another question from online, I just wanted to thank our outstanding program and publicity committees for getting these fantastic programs. Sandra, another question from from Zoom.
Francesca, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Okay, I think she's having mic trouble, so I will ask it. Do we have an explanation for why kestrels and red-winged blackbirds are diminishing when raptors and wetland birds are increasing overall?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I mean, here I am, I'm just pontificating, right? Because we really need to look at the life cycle of each species to try to understand what's happening there. But a couple things in general, blackbirds, right? Blackbirds are one of those top 3 families that together showed the greatest loss of individuals. So what's going on with blackbirds? I think, again, it comes down to our agricultural lands and how those are changing. The pesticides that are used, the neonicotinoid pesticides in particular, although they're applied very specifically and only for a short window of time, they are up to 1,000 times more toxic than DDT. So all it takes is 1 or 2 grains of this pesticide to be ingested by these birds, and they become sick and die. So blackbirds tend to feed a lot in agricultural fields. And I've seen quite a bit of video evidence from Mexico in particular of yellow-headed blackbirds that seem to be sick from pesticides, just unable to fly, convulsing, pretty horrific stuff. And that's been pretty widely reported down there. And I've assumed it's because they're ingesting pesticides right at the start of the growing season down there, and they're never able to leave their wintering grounds. Blackbirds are also still controlled in a massive way, killed on purpose by our wildlife services agencies and other agencies to try to limit damage to agricultural crops. And so millions and millions of blackbirds, red-winged blackbirds primarily, also brown-headed cowbirds, grackles, rusty blackbirds, and other species all get killed together through these control efforts. Yeah, that's my take on the blackbirds. Kestrels, I think it's, again, similarly the intensification of the agricultural landscape where these birds nested previously, the loss of nest sites, and the loss of food. Now, they eat both insects and small rodents, which again need insects and to survive. So I think the breakdown of the food chain in some of these agricultural areas may be responsible. But again, those are just my hunches based on what I know of how those habitats those birds live in are changing.
Question from the audience.
Is the water that is flowing onto the plowed land, is that just the regular rainfall, that there's no irrigation in those areas, or is there?
Are you talking about
In Mexico? Or,
in the restoration
yeah, in
areas
the
or
restoration areas.
Yeah, that's just rainfall
Mhm.
that comes after we plow in those hard pan areas, those barren hard pan areas. Then we try to time it, so we do it just before the rains come. Hopefully the rains come. Yeah, but that's just rainwater. Yep.
You were saying earlier that they're using some fossil at dinner, you were saying,
So
fossil water.
that is for cropland agriculture, for growing
Oh.
crops like corn and wheat and soybeans and other things, commercial crops. So that is being supported mainly through groundwater pumping, right? And that's sort of the big game changer that's happened down there starting about 20 years ago, was a massive, government subsidized expansion of the electric grid that allowed farmers to switch from their traditional small scale practices to having electricity to pump groundwater from 700 feet below their surface. which they could never do before. So that's facilitated a lot of the breaking up of the desert in the grasslands.
Sandra, a question from Zoom.
Yes, we have been talking here about cats and bird feeders and the fact that we like to have bird feeders around and see the birds, but also the cats. So the question is feeding birds a net win for conservation of birds, or what, you know, or is that conditional on certain times and so on? And are there do's and don'ts about seeds or hummingbird feeders that make it a net win for conservation?
Yeah, great question. I think overall it is a net win, but the net positive can vary a lot depending on what kinds of precautions and things we put into place when we feed birds. Two major factors that can lead to higher mortality around bird feeders is collisions with windows and then predation by cats. So if you have a cat problem, hopefully it's not your cat. If it's your cat, bring it in. But oftentimes it's the neighbor's cat or you don't know whose cat it is. Then that can pose a real conflict for feeding birds, right? Because you don't want to draw in birds to a place where they're going to have a higher risk of being killed. So that's something you just have to weigh carefully at your site. The bird collision, or I'm sorry, the window collision issue is something that we can also take measures to minimize. And one simple way is to either keep your bird feeders within 3 feet of a window or more than 30 feet away from a window, but not in between those distances, because those are that in-between distance, like 10 to 15 feet especially, that allows the birds to get up just enough speed when they get scared and head towards a window that they're going to die when they hit that window or get seriously injured. So if you have them real close to your windows, it's a great way to see the birds up close. And if they do spook because of a predator, you know, they'll just bounce off the window and be fine. They don't get up at enough speed to hurt themselves. So those are 2 things you can consider. Obviously, the third is, you know, keeping your feeders clean. If you see birds, particularly house finches, showing signs of illness, they tend to get something called what is it called? Conjunctivitis. Thank you. Conjunctivitis, and it's pretty apparent when they get it. Their eyes puff up and swell shut, and the birds become lethargic and don't respond. If you see that happening, take down your feeders, clean them with bleach, keep them down for a few days, let the birds disperse, and then you can resume your feeding after a few days. So there's definitely things we can do to make bird feeding more of a net positive. But I think in general, a lot of species that do frequent feeders are doing perhaps better because of the feeders. But on the other hand, there's birds that frequent feeders that are still declining, but it's probably due to, like, white-crowned sparrows and white-throated sparrows, but probably due to other factors.
Any questions from the audience? Fantastic talk, Arvind, and I think we always get inspired, and thank you for your positive message on conservation and what we can do. And thank you again.
Thank you.